part of the mission of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences states that students will learn to devise and apply innovative solutions, embrace divergent worldviews, and consider ethical implications of their actions. So tonight, Dr. Holly Folk will help us do this as she discusses nesting boxes, American communes, and the liberal arts. Dr. Folk teaches in our Liberal Studies Department at Western. She earned her doctorate in American Religious History at Indiana University, and she wrote her thesis on the emergence of chiropractic out of vital magnetic healing. She is a historian, but she self-identifies primarily as a new religious movement scholar, and she studies 19th and 20th century American religion and culture. And her research addresses a variety of social movements that typically fall outside the mainstream. So things like new religions, communes and utopias, anarchism, and alternative medicine. Within the world of communes, she's most familiar with the Dowieites of Zion City, Illinois, and the anarchists at the Mutual Home Colony Association near Tacoma, Washington. These are two different types of cultural radicals in the progressive era. She's served on the board of the Communal Studies Association since 2010. At Western, she teaches in Theory and Methods, American Religious History, and Modern World Religion, and she recently finished a book that should be published in 2017 entitled Vertebral Vitalism, The Birth of Chiropractic. So it's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Holly Folk.
Well, thank you. Welcome, and I thought I would explain a little bit about the logic by which I arrived at my title in my first slide and my prop, because I have a wonderful prop, and I will say right now thank you to Philip McIntosh from South Union, Kentucky at the Shaker site there, because he made these and he sold these at a very, very nice discount because he knew I was going to do this presentation. If you like these, I can give you his contact information later. Lots and lots of gratitude there. So this is a Shaker object, or at least it's a very nice reproduction of a Shaker object, and you can see sort of where this is going in terms of nesting boxes. There are two more in here. I'm intrigued by the fact that in the liberal arts, and definitely in religious studies, there's this motif that's been popular over the past couple of years of a boxed narrative. And in fact, one of the past presidents of the American Academy of Religion gave a presentation at the AAR talking about the Mahabharata as a boxed narrative, a story that contains another story, that contains another story, and really you can kind of draw connections through several different levels of content. That's my hope today in terms of talking about the relationship between a particular commune, the Shakers, and communal studies, and really how that fits with my teaching and how I really sort of understand the humanities as kind of a divergent scholar. So let me say a little bit about the Shakers, and I'll explain why I settled on this particular group. Today is the birthday of Ann Lee, and this is not a real engraving drawn from life. This is a psychometric or spiritual drawing that was done in the 19th century, but it is the portrait that Shakers regard as most authentic of their founder. So it's a little bit kind of remembered descriptions and a lot of kind of intuited, revealed representation. But it's her birthday today. And if we were really celebrating this, which the Shakers started to do in 1841, 56 years after she died, we would be eating a white 3-layer layer cake with peach jam, and you're supposed to cut peach switches. They have these at Hagen right now, so you can go home and try this. You're supposed to break and bruise the peach switches to impart a delicate peach flavor to the cake. And this is the traditional Shaker birthday cake from Mother Ann Lee. In fact, this is kind of a historic day because Shaker communitarians, Shaker historians, use this day as an occasion to hold special events. There are fundraisers all over the East Coast, and there are a lot of communal studies scholars who've gathered at the University of Kansas at a friend's house, my friend Tim Miller, and they're actually having a party where they're going to eat birthday cake. I don't think they do the peach thing, but I do know that they'll gather and they'll sing Shaker songs and stomp their feet a lot, because that's one of the things that you do when you do Shaker music. So I thought that one way to kind of get into how Shakerism really works as a religion is to talk about Shaker theology in terms of worship and in terms of dance. And dance is worship for the Shakers. So I'd like to give you two words to think about with Shaker culture, and really we can use these to kind of structure the talk all the way through. One is gift and one is order. And in terms of understanding both of these terms, it's helpful to remember that the Shakers emerged out of Quakerism in the 18th century in England. And so if you know anything about Quaker culture, Quaker worship is often very quietist. You sit, you wait, you don't have a lot of vocal ministry until somebody is moved to speak or do something, at which point the worship can become very energetic, very spontaneous. There's a real sort of balance between very structured, quietist religious experience and really sort of managed occasions for exuberance, which I think is really sort of an art in terms of thinking about religious life. So this is a mid-19th century photo of Shakers, but I'll give you some pictures from the dance, and we can sort of see what this looks like. Okay. So this is in the 18th century. The Shakers start in England. Anne Lee is born in 1736. She's converted to Quakerism in 1758. She arrives in the United States with a handful of followers in 1774, shortly before the American Revolution. In both England and in the United States, the Shakers are seen as sort of a controversial movement. They're exuberant. They become known for doing these very elaborate, very physical line dances, stomping dances, moving dances. This was sort of an enthusiastic style of worship, except for sometimes when the worship was heavily scripted. So we'll see both of these themes. Worship, the movement that is regimented, and movement that is very, very exuberant. We'll see how this goes through a number of representations. So the Shakers had very specific movements that would go with particular songs, turning and bowing. And if you've ever heard the song Simple Gifts, you can sort of kind of connect the dots and realize that when they say turn or when they say bend, these are things that people actually did in worship. This is an image of two women who are sort of modeling this for the camera. You bend, you definitely bend. Sometimes the worship would become so exuberant that you would simply fall down and be sort of slain in the spirit. That's how evangelicals would describe this, but really, simply kind of collapse from the energy. This is one of the reasons why Shakers become seen as sort of a controversial movement. In England, they have to leave because they've gone to jail at one point in the early 1770s. In the United States, in the beginning too, they're seen as sort of a wild, frenzied, deviant sect. And it's interesting to sort of think, how do they go to become known as this very ordered culture? And this happens over time. So okay, I'm on pause. Okay, so what do I say? Well, Anne Lee arrives in New York with 8 followers. One of them is her husband in 1774. By 1775, early 1776, the Shakers have settled at a site in upstate New York called Watervliet. Her husband leaves and takes up with another woman. They gather a small number of followers, but they set up a communal life in this upstate colony. The American Revolution happens, and they keep their heads down. It's only in about 1780 that Anne Lee begins to actually do any type of evangelism to outsiders. And between 1780 and 1784, she travels through Connecticut and Massachusetts and upstate New York, and she heals people. And there are people who attest that she's cured them of cancer. You always have to wonder when you hear a cancer reference in an 18th century document. But she's known as sort of a wonder worker and a mystic, and she gathers a lot of interest. She dies in 1784. Here's her grave at Water-Valide. But over the next few years, her followers build a number of additional colonies. This is an image from Water-Valide. Okay. They set up, eventually, 18 permanent colonies. There are 4 that sort of start and then they end relatively early. 2 are merged. 1 in Indiana is really close. So when people think about Shaker culture, they usually think 18 major communities that stay for a while, all the way from Maine down to Kentucky. Over the 19th century, people gather that something between 17 and 20,000 Americans participated in the Shaker movement for sometimes very short period of time. Probably close to 5,000 people were part of the Shaker movement for a durable period of time, for much of their life, or sometimes even for all of their lives. So in the small number, it's not a huge movement, but it's an important movement in terms of its impact on American culture and on American religious life in some ways. So here's a setting. This is a scene from Alfred, Maine, one of the sites they set up. And this one is Canterbury, New Hampshire. Here's some women. You can see that they have a very sort of distinctive dress code that develops. And they come to adopt this by the 19th century, and they keep it through most of the 20th, in fact. The Shakers established a communal lifestyle where they lived and worked in families on these colonies. So you would be assigned to a family that would have somewhere between 30 and 90 people. They would not usually be your blood relatives. They would be people from the community who were assigned, and you would live in a group housing with them. You would eat with them. You would arrange most of your work with them. You would do each other's laundry. And you didn't really spend too much time interacting with people who were from other families on your Shaker settlement. This is one of the things that's interesting, that communication with other groups was discouraged. So this is a theme that I think is really interesting in communal studies in general, the way that intimacy and individualism and collective bonding are sometimes very astutely managed. Again, you think about communal studies, it's interesting to kind of think about how human relations are creatively redone in many ways. So, here's the traditional Shaker dress code, and you can sort of see the specifics in terms of the shawl, the cap, and things. And they were known to wear their caps so tightly that none of their hair would show. And the line which Charles Nordhoff uses to describe them is that you cannot tell the age of these women because their hair is so tightly pinned back that only if you look at their face can you tell if somebody is a young girl or much older. The Shakers had a notion of order as well. They believed in clean lines. They believed in principles of embodying a sense of stability, embodying God's will in everything they did. And I should probably stop and move away from this before I scroll too far into these slides. This is a good place to stay, although I'll take the pause thing away. I want to tell you some things about Shaker theology that you probably don't know. You probably know about the chairs. You may or may not know about the chairs being hung on the wall. This is a very distinctive Shaker thing. But you may not know certain things about Shaker belief. So let me run you through some of them. Ann Lee joined a movement that was pre-existing. So Shakerism, in terms of shaking Quakers, predates her. She joins the movement, and she brings a version of it to the United States, to the colonies. She has her own revelations that throw a very distinct spin on Shakerism as it develops in America. Ann Lee is poor. She's the daughter of a blacksmith. She marries a guy who doesn't really make much money. He's definitely working class. And she has 4 children relatively quickly. All of them die either in childbirth or in infancy. And this is really devastating to her. So after losing her 4th child, she has a revelation that original sin is literally the fornication that Adam and Eve did when they used their bodily parts without God's permission. And the notion is that they were supposed to have waited until God gave them permission to use their bodily parts. But in the meantime, we were living in the state of the fall, and you're not supposed to procreate until God has restored what they called gospel order, which is, by the way, an idea that also comes out of Quakerism. It's the principle that once humanity has been atoned to God, we will live in a new state of being, and there may be very, very different laws and principles of reality that come through at that time. So you have this notion of celibacy very, very strongly reinforced in Shakerism. It gets reinforced in the architecture. This is a fortuitous slide, because there's a very good chance that that room had two doors so women and men could enter on either side. And in fact, many of the buildings would have parallel staircases for women and men to go up either side. But here's the other piece that really you have to wrap your head around. A room like this, a building like this, if you were to face forward, there might be dormitory rooms on this side, there might be dormitory rooms on this side. This might be for women, this might be for men. And then you have to kind of imagine you're living in a lifestyle that is regimented enough that you come up by different staircases, but you're sharing a dorm floor, guys and girls, on different sides of the same building. So again, it's an interesting sort of paradox in terms of being very intimate and being very managed at the same time. Okay, so keeping going and telling a little bit more about Shaker theology, you understand that gender is very, very proscribed. But the Shakers were very egalitarian and very positive for women. And in fact, women outnumbered men 2-to-1 in the Shaker movement, which is one of the reasons why all the photos are mostly of girls. Okay. One of the things that's interesting about Shaker conceptions of gender, Lee has a revelation that God itself is hermaphroditic and has a feminine side and a masculine side. And one of the beliefs that really got her into trouble is that she came to the idea that she herself had some revelation of the second appearing of Christ, and she picked up on a notion that had pre-existed in the Shaking Quakers in England, that the second incarnation of Jesus would return as a woman. So Lee herself never really arrives at the point where she says, I am Christ incarnate. But one of the things that happens over the next 50 years is Shakerism really does come to believe that Lee is Christ's second appearing, which is why we wind up with the name, the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing. One more point about Shakerism coming out of Quakerism. Shakerism takes the notion of continuing revelation and runs with it. For Quakers, the idea of continuing revelation is that if you are quiet, the Spirit of God can speak through you in a way that's comparable to how the prophets in the Bible sort of communicated spiritual messages. The Shakers also believe this, but they believe it and they also believe that there are all sorts of other possibilities in terms of spiritual realities that can be communicated to people. So over the 19th century, they become very, very interested in esotericism. They hold seances. I'll show you a picture in a little bit. And you want to take seriously the idea that they are very open to an expansive spiritual world. Okay. This is a bad photo, but here you can sort of see the men's and the women's sides of the hallway. This is a traditional Shaker bedroom. This is most likely in South Union. There are tourist sites where you can go and you can stay in a room like this now if you visit Pleasant Hill or South Union. You can see sort of the very distinctive architecture. They really did line everything with pegboards, and then they hung everything on pegboards for efficiency. You would hang your chairs up, you would hang baskets, you would hang clothing. They made all sorts of handle things like candle holders and basket holders and things, so you could sort of simply carry them around, and you had all of this very convenient modular furniture. I would like to do more of this in my house, in fact. They became very, very known for their design. They would make round barns. At least one of these they built very astutely into a hill, so you could kind of go up the hill from one side, and you could bring in the grain and the other items from a wagon from the top and then sort of throw it down to the bottom. you'll see when I show you the next slide, as you see sort of inside, it has kind of a spiral. Shakers were very inventive in terms of how they thought about things. Very, very well known for their design, famous staircase at South Union. Now, there was a documentary that was made in the 1990s, and there was a woman who was interviewed, one of the women from the Sabbath Day Colony. She literally says, "I think I'm going to be remembered as a chair." And this became the title of this Canadian documentary. So our goal for tonight, among other things, is to hopefully not simply talk about the Shakers as chairs, but to really sort of work again on this idea of gift and this idea of order. So let me tell you a little bit about order and then a little bit more about gift, okay? Ann Lee died in 1784. The Shaker colonies were mostly founded afterward. There was a period of some disruption. It was a little bit challenging to figure out how do you build an entire society of people who are living in communes, miles and miles apart. There are certain sets of customs that sort of develop, and in 1821 they become codified as something called the millennial laws. And when I think about the millennial laws, there's one that I think is such a good detail. I'll tell you in a moment, but let me start by saying, if you think about communes, one of the things that makes them interesting is the way that they very often reinvent or create new cultures, okay? And I think this is one of the things that really kind of draws in my students when I teach about communes. There's an anthropologist from the 1950s named Claude Lévi-Strauss. And when he talks about culture making, he's got a metaphor of taking something raw and making it cooked. And I think that this is apropos for the Shakers because the millennial laws governed all aspects of life. They governed, among other things, how you could eat cucumbers. And you could not eat cucumbers if you did not cut them up, put them on a plate, and season them with salt and pepper. Why do you have to do that to a cucumber? You are not supposed to eat an apple, pulling it off the tree and simply biting into it. You are supposed to cut it into pieces and put it on a plate. Remember that notion of the raw and the cooked. But on the other hand, my other major dietary favorite data point about the Shakers is this. Here's one of their rules. You're not supposed to eat bread the day that it's baked. You're not supposed to eat fresh bread. You're supposed to let it wait and sit and dry out for a day, and you can only eat bread that's a day old. Why would they do this? Well, maybe this is a disciplining process. Maybe this is a way of making culture conform. Maybe this is a way of reinventing the world. It might help to realize that this notion of not eating fresh bread comes out of 19th century Broussardist dietary theology. And it actually locates the Shakers in a particular sort of cultural reform movement, and it reflects their integration in a particular subculture, not their separation. And so I think sometimes one of the mysteries of detecting the priorities of a group in the past is to sort of figure out what have they created from whole cloth and what have they borrowed or drawn in from elsewhere. Last point about Shaker order and the millennial laws. They had rules for physical behavior. Okay, so when you got up out of bed in the morning, you're supposed to step out of bed with your right foot, and then your left, and you button your left and your right side of the pants first, then your left, you tie your right shoe, then your left, and then when you go downstairs for breakfast, you're supposed to walk with your head erect and your fingertips ever so slightly touching, and you're supposed to have your hand on your stomach, this is hard to do, and you're supposed to be walking on your toes. So if you think about it, there's a whole regimentation for how this goes. It's exhausting to sort of think about it. But I want you to sort of think that the notion of Shaker order is meant to extend through many, many different aspects of life. So it is in that sense, really sort of world making and lots of fun to think about. The Shaker work ethic becomes very, very famous. They are known for their craftsmanship. They're also known for their inventions. They invent the flat broom. Isn't that wonderful? They also revolutionized the garden seed business. And this is a photo from Enfield, Enfield, Connecticut, all this land has turned into a prison in Connecticut now. This building is still available, but most of this land has actually been bought by the state. But in Enfield, Connecticut, they started a garden seed business and did very, very well, selling Shaker's Best flower seeds and vegetable seeds. And you can sort of see sort of more of their boxes. You can buy these at auctions today, but definitely bring your checkbook. And they also were very interested in the patent medicine industry. So this is for cephalic snuff. I have not yet figured out what cephalic snuff is. And this one's the best. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Pain King, King of all pain destroyers. What in the world is this? We have absolutely no idea, but lots and lots of fun to sort of see and think about. By the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, the Shakers had become known for their thrift and their industry, and they were exemplars of Max Weber's Protestant ethic, which is so funny because in the 19th century, they really sort of came across as dangerous religious enthusiasts. But now here we have this lithograph portraying the life of the diligent Shaker. Isn't it wonderful? They're such good burgeoning capitalists. How great. Okay. But here is the thing. The gift side of Shakerism never gets conquered. And you see, in spite of order, you see an outpouring of spirit that characterizes the movement in lots and lots of ways. Between 1837 and 1844, there's an outpouring of spiritual activity called the Era of Manifestations. And people begin to get spiritual revelations and messages from Ann Lee, and eventually from other spirits. And they begin to receive spiritual inspirations that cause them to make these types of drawings that they say where the actual artist is a spirit sort of inhabiting or visiting the person who's creating this. So this is a tree of life, very, very famous image. And let's see, where's another one? Here's another spirit drawing. So sometimes some esoteric symbols. Here's a dove of peace. Before I move on, let me tell you another thing that shows up in the Era of Manifestations, along with spirit drawings and spirit communications. They would have spiritual gifts, and I always do this to my students. They can't wrap their heads around it. This spirit gave me the most wonderful cupcake, and I just feel led to give it to you. Now this turns out to be sort of disruptive to the movement because it's mostly young girls who are involved and begin just demonstrating this enthusiastic behavior. And as my dissertation advisor, Stephen Stein, pointed out in an article called Shaker Gift and Shaker Order, this movement gets sort of contained or managed when the elders of the community also begin to demonstrate spiritual gifts and start giving each other spiritual apples and spiritual cupcakes and spiritual jewelry and things like this. So it's really sort of wonderful. But you want to think this openness to the world beyond, to different types of spirits, to angels, to the souls of the dead, sometimes eventually to the spirits of Indian chiefs or George Washington or any number of other celebrities, all become available in the Shaker tradition as really sort of expressions of this theme of order. Here's a spirit letter where a spirit came and gave a communicated message to one of the Shakers. So another spirit drawing. I think that these are great. They also, by the mid-19th century, they can become very, very interested in Shakerism. Not Shakerism, sorry, in spiritualism. And by the later 19th century, their leader, Warren Felt Evans, becomes the editor of a very prominent spiritualist newspaper. And so because of Evans, the Shakers become sort of a major exponent of spiritualist information. So that's kind of great to know. Here's Warren Felt Evans, the prominent sort of spiritualist Shaker leader. And, so I love this picture. And I want to use this picture as a segue about talking about something with Shakerism that can kind of sort of slip from view. And that is the way that Shakerism is simultaneously sort of very regimenting and conforming, and also oriented to individuality. As a rule of thumb, I don't want to make too many rules because that makes me sound like Auguste Comte or something, but like, as a rule of thumb, I would say that communes do better when they find ways to let people feel enough like themselves without really being too disruptive. So you have to find ways to let people manage and retain a sense of self, have a sense of individuality, and also find ways that people aren't just running willy-nilly. The Shakers in their early years did not allow for instruments. Their music was simply sung. But by the middle of the 19th century, they really did sort of loosen this, and women were allowed to do pursuits. And in fact, this is not the only Shaker woman with saxophone photo that you can find if you go Googling images. But it does give you a sense that Shakers, they responded intelligently and adaptively to changes and to the priorities of members in a way that preserved Shaker individuality. So let me talk a little bit about how individualism gets handled with the Shakers. Through art and needlework and handcrafts and craftsmanship for the men who did cabinetry. So really you can sort of think that you're working for the Spirit of God, for the glory of God. You're trying to do everything you possibly can as an expression of being the best person you can in God's name. But on the other hand, it's also a celebration of the creative, which is wonderful. It took me until this weekend to really kind of realize that the Shakers are different than some communes in that they encourage and cultivate personal friendships. And this only sort of makes sense if you actually realize that the Oneida colony in upstate New York would be very, very upset if two people had any type of personal preference for each other, whether it's an opposite-sex couple who might be romantic, or even two women or two men who are two close friends. They didn't like that type of one-on-one intimacy. But the Shakers encouraged personal friendships, and we have these amazing collections of letters testifying to the fact that people knew each other and invested in each other very, very much. The Shakers did recognize each other on an individual level for relationships. Brothers would be assigned to individual sisters for personal care. So you would get one person, you're supposed to make sure that his socks were darned and that type of thing. This one, I think, is actually the most fascinating thing about Shakers for me, and I love this. The Shakers had something called union meeting, and they did this as many as 3 times a week, and you have to sort of think about it. The Shaker Society in general doesn't let women and men talk. You live in the same building, but men sit at one table for meals, women sit at another table for meals. It's extremely inappropriate for people to be making idle conversation. If somebody comes to the kitchen to drop off a load of vegetables, you say thank you and you send them on your way, but you never have much time for one-on-one interaction with the opposite sex, except during union meeting. And during union meeting, a few nights a week, the men and the women would go into either each other's bedrooms or into the main worship hall, and they would set up lines of chairs about 5 feet apart this way, and then pairs of chairs, so another 5 feet here and 5 feet here. And you would sit opposite your partner, and you might be assigned to your union partner for years if you guys were getting along, and you would simply talk freely. And I asked my dissertation advisor at one point, because he did a lot of work on this, I said, did people talk about the price of onions? Or were these intimate conversations? And he said yes, depending on the couple. And that for some of these people, these were actually very, very intimate relationships that they had, where they talked very personally about their spiritual lives and what mattered to them, a couple times a week in this very sort of structured public setting. But think about it. They created occasions for people to talk very, very sort of freely, very casually, to do maybe not flirting, but something in the order of sort of simply banter on a structured timetable, okay, in a setting where it's going to be completely monitored. Okay. The Shakers started to accept African American members no later than the 1790s. That's the first recorded instance we have of people who are African American. Over the 19th century, there were other African American people who joined. And in fact, this is Rebecca Cox Jackson. She became an eldress, and she founded a Shaker colony in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that was intended to minister exclusively to African American people. She was really sort of on the gift side of the Shaker tradition. She did not always get along with the elders at Water of Lead, but when the colony in Philadelphia closed, she did go back and she spent the rest of her life in Shaker community. So this is one of the things that Shaker scholars are working on bringing forward right now. The other thing you should know about Shakerism in terms of its population, I said a little bit ago that at their peak, maybe in the 1850s, they had about 5,000 members. The Shakers in the 19th century took in a lot of orphans. And this was one of their main population bases for running some of these communes. Over the 19th century, as the years passed on, as local governments and as federal government got better at providing foundling homes, children's aid societies, those types of institutions, the Shakers no longer were seen as quite sort of the site where you would simply take children who you really couldn't raise. And so they lost that population base. They had a hard time with retention in general. In the 19th century, a lot of people joined simply because they didn't want to work hard and they needed a place to stay in the winter. So winter Shakers might be there from December until April, and then they'd go off on their way. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to get a full count of Shaker people. But what we do know is that by the 1870s, the Shakers had fallen to about 2,400. So their numbers fell about by half by the last quarter of the 19th century. And then I have some decline statistics, which are really sort of dramatic, so I'll have to read them. By 1884, they were down to 1850. Okay? By 1900, they had 855 members. By 1936, they were down to 92 Shakers. And by 1961, only 2 colonies were still in operation, and the rest had closed. So, in 1965, the Shakers made sort of a controversial decision. They've backtracked on it. They double down sometimes, but they decided that they were going to close the society and not take in new members. Since then, there have been a handful of people who have joined. Most of those people have left. One person remains from that later generation of Shaker conversion. But the group is down to 3 living people, 2 of whom are so elderly that they're in assisted living. And yet, there are about 200 people who show up at the site at Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, every Sunday and worship with the Shakers and provide support and spiritual nurture. And this is very in the spirit of traditional Shakerism, because in the 19th century, not everybody who actually aligned with the movement joined the community and lived in those separate hallways. And the movement has always had people who were sort of partly in, but not fully in. And in that sense, you realize that this movement is not really going to die with these last 3 people, although I will say that I know certain archivists and historians who are just very, very worried about the health of these 2 elderly ladies. So I guess it's a matter of perspective. Representation of the last 3. They dress a little differently now. This is in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, which is the one remaining Shaker site. The rest have mostly been turned into historic districts. And in most of these towns, you can either find a sign like this, or you might actually find a museum or a living history museum in the case of a place like Pleasant Hill. So these are the places that you could visit if you were interested in knowing more about Shakerism on a first-hand level. And this is probably a good time for me to open up this box and say I'm now kind of connecting to Shaker studies instead of the Shaker tradition. I'll leave that open. And I wanted to tell you something about communal studies. I'm doing okay for time. I've been checking this. And say something about this is my dissertation advisor, Stephen Stein, who wrote The Shaker Experience in America. I highly, highly recommend it. He's the person who really sort of got me interested in communalism as an area of venture. A very, very tolerant dissertation advisor, and very, very tolerant when I decided I wanted to write an article about a flat earth commune. That was the Dowieites. As it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm on the board of the Communal Studies Association. The Communal Studies Association is an academic society with about 150 members. We're interesting because not everybody is a historian or a trained liberal arts scholar. We take in a lot of archivists and curators and people involved in historic preservation. And so in that sense, we're a little bit more broad in the multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary sort of scheme of things than sometimes you think of. And we also have a discount rate in drawing a lot of people who are past and present members of communes. And so it's very, very common to find people who were raised as Mennonite or raised as Hutterite. The lady I room with on a regular basis is a survivor from People's Temple. And so you really get kind of a lot of firsthand experience at the CSA. We're going to have our conference this year will be in Salt Lake City. So if you want the call for papers, I can definitely send you that. You can learn more about it. It's coming up very soon. We publish a journal called Communal Societies. And this is our board on that staircase from that first interesting slide. It's a nice staircase. So I'm bringing this up to say that communal studies is not just the Shakers. I was supposed to talk about communes, and I have to say here's a great big shout out to Charles LeaAnn, who is a Western Washington University graduate. And he went to Woodring a number of years ago, but he wrote Utopias on the Puget Sound, which is a great book about Washington State. It includes information about home Washington, among other places. This is a great picture from home. And Chuck also wrote a great book called The Love Israel Family about, drum roll please, of course, Love Israel, who is down in Seattle. So one of the things that we can boast about is we have a wonderful, wonderful Western Washington University contingent. Chuck's not the only person to graduate from the school giving CSA representation. So really sort of super. Now I have to open up my last box and explain how all of this connects to the liberal arts. I was thinking about this a lot, and one of the ways in which I use this is I actually teach Rosabeth Moss Cantor's book, Commitment and Community. If I say so myself, I think my students really like it. It seems to be sort of a winner each time I do it. But Cantor's interesting because she did this as her dissertation, and she mostly teaches in Harvard's business school. And so it's interesting to sort of think that communal studies seems to have a very, very good, strong overlap with business management and human relations theory. And in fact, it's wonderful to sort of be able to sort of sneak in those methodologies and orientations into the liberal arts sometimes. This is my friend Laura Cole. She's the lady who was in People's Temple. She wrote a book that we use in, she's from People's Temple. She wrote a book that we use in my intro religion class called Jonestown Survivor. And a couple of years ago, with funding from the VPUE at Western, she came and she did a presentation for students, and she also did a public talk. So in that sense, it's really sort of great to say we've been able to kind of introduce some sort of hands-on information, direct information into the curriculum. I've also coached 2 students through studies on communes. I had a student a couple of years ago who wrote a senior thesis on the Church Universal and Triumphant. This was started by Elizabeth Clare Prophet. I don't know if you remember her. She's about 20 years ago, out in Montana. And I have another student whose name is John Sheridan, who's now in graduate school researching the Hutterites. He's at the University of Colorado doing a funded master's in the study of religion. He started researching the Hutterites at Western, and he's never stopped. And I see him at CSA now, and it is like the most wonderful, wonderful thing to find a student who's actually growing up and going to graduate school. Okay, how does this all connect? I think, along with talking about here's my curriculum, I wanted to stress a few things in terms of lessons that we can take from communalism as an impulse. I think that for me, the biggest piece is how this impacts my pedagogy and my learning goals. Communal studies, both in terms of running a commune and understanding how they run it, and also the venture of creating this field, is very practical. You have to interweave applied knowledge with some things that are sort of sometimes very sort of esoteric information sort of a long time ago. Why do you even need to remember that? It's information that sort of makes you navigate between things that are sort of very large and holistic and very granular, and a need for being precise. Our field is interdisciplinary, and sometimes far more interdisciplinary than I even know what to do with. We teach different methodologies, and you need certain methodologies to understand some of the information that comes out of these groups. When I talk to my students, I tell my students that really to understand communes, because they close so quickly, very, very often, you're very often doing a certain type of cultural forensics. And unfortunately, when you look at a group that's closed, you're often, very often looking back and saying, what went wrong? But I tell my students that this is helpful, that this type of exercise is very helpful in terms of learning a certain type of systems analysis. And when I think about communes, I think that that's one of the most useful things. It's a really great place for students to sort of test, how do you work with ideas? How do you work with a system, a set of material, a set of conditions where there are a lot of moving parts? How do you handle complexity? I think that that's very important for me as a teaching goal. And then lastly, I think that one of the things that communes really sort of show us is that the permanent attractiveness of communal life is rooted in face-to-face relations. And in that sense, it really argues for the need for the liberal arts to be personal, to be high impact, to be oriented to student formation, to many of those very sort of traditional notions in education dealing with students in a very sort of hands-on way. We're living in a dramatic moment of social change for colleges and higher education, but I think that those values of preserving the intimacy of the liberal arts is very, very important, not only because I like it, but because I think it's the best way to teach students. As we think about the future, I hope that we can kind of remember that message and remember maybe other message that communal scholars are very aware of, and that is in responding to change, it is most helpful when groups can be intentional. When they don't respond buffeted about by things that have sort of come through, but when they themselves are able to sort of say, we will decide and we will preserve our agency and preserve the fundamental values of our community. The Shakers have managed to do that for more than 200 years, and I think that they're a very good group to admire. I guess I'm done.
I'm curious, like, what you think are some examples of the differences between, like, a commune that could potentially be healthy and beneficial for its members and sort of shifting into cults and, you know, something that could become very much the opposite for its members, and, like, how you think that shift occurs.
So this is tough. When I'm teasing my students, I say a group is only a cult if they live in a bunker. And I've got a few groups where I'm okay using the C word, but I'd say in general, cults are groups that some group of outsiders doesn't like. And so cult, commune, intentional community, new religious movement, these are placings, these are aesthetic placings more than something qualitative. But here's what I know, that I would propose that for many communities, you're going to find people who will say opposite things. This was the most manipulative, abusive environment I've ever found, and this was highly fulfilling for me. And so in that sense, I think it's rare that you find a group where you can make that type of blanket judgment. For myself, I'm very, very uncomfortable with groups that use physical coercion. I'm also personally very uncomfortable with groups that use what I can see as perceptible psychological coercion. But new religious movement scholars tend to draw the distinction at physical violence. And they recognize that once we get into the emotional sides of things, it gets very, very subjective. And you have to sort of look at an individual person's experience, basically.
John. Well, as you know, Holly, I think I've told you before, I grew up quite close to the Sabbath Day Lake community and was a not infrequent visitor there because we raised sheep and learned from the men and women who were raising sheep there, who went swimming in Sabbath Day Lake. And it was a pleasure to see just a couple of images there of that community. But I remember, and this is a memory going back to childhood, so I undoubtedly have it wrong, but what I learned at that community was that Mother Ann was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. So again, the feminine side of God, but specifically an incarnation of the Holy
Yes.
Spirit.
Yes.
And I thought I heard you say she was a second incarnation of Christ.
The Christ within. So this is sort of messy, where Quakers and Shakers regard the Christ Spirit as something that comes to inhabit Jesus, and then something that comes to inhabit Ann Lee, and that is available to everybody if they listen and they wait for the Spirit to communicate directly with them. But you're totally, totally right, that it's not a literal incarnation of Jesus, but that it's this second receipt of a certain type of spiritual reality.
Can I ask a follow-up then on that?
Sure.
Well, two-part. One, was this widely known outside the Shaker community, and was that a matter of controversy when it was known? And then within the Shaker community, were there any special ways in which she was commemorated in prayer, liturgy, worship, that focused on that new divine incarnation that she represented?
I don't know too much about how widely the gendered theology spread outside of Shakerism, although there are exposés that are published in the 19th century that sort of reveal secrets of Shakerism, and very often they talk about them as sort of religious fanatics, and they also talk about their millennial expectation. So that's, I think, an important piece, and I'm sorry, the other half of your question just fell out of my head.
Or just within the community, whether we have a kind of on record, a special emphasis
this
in
is
prayer,
easy.
liturgy?
Lots.
Okay.
Lots.
Yeah.
And so you have, I was playing a CD before when people are coming in, you have lots and lots of songs that are written devotionally to Mother Ann. The birthday cake happens during the era of manifestations, but they wind up doing this as sort of a devotional celebration where it becomes a major Shaker holiday. There's a lot of sort of reverence for her. You hope for a spirit message from Mother Ann. She definitely becomes very much sort of a figure of devotion. So yeah, it's cool.
I'm curious about rites of passage for becoming a Shaker, and then for people that leave, how are they treated?
I don't know if they had that much of a rite of passage, and I'm not sure that I don't think it's even just my ignorance. I don't think that they did, because they stressed a certain type of simplicity and humility. But what they very often did was, if somebody said they wanted to join, they'd say, come live with us for a while and see if you like our lifestyle, and then decide. And so in that sense, the rite of passage, I think, was much more you would be asked to live in the community and see if you could live up to the lifestyle and the expectations. And once you were ready, I think that you would basically sort of either sign away your property or decide to fully join. There were lots and lots of people who never completely joined to the extent of living as part of a Shaker family. And so one of the things that can drop from view is that there were people who were sort of half in and half out of the community, who would go for worship and would very often go and do work on the commune during the day, but would still simply go home and stay at home with their families. There were married Shakers who didn't want to actually give up their marriages and who lived in this sort of halfway life. And there's a collection of letters called Letters from a Young Shaker about a guy named William Byrd, who never really fully joins the Shaker community in Kentucky, but he has this sort of ongoing interest and ongoing communication, and he's about ready to join when he dies. So.
Well, I'm curious about partnering and having children. Was there marriage then within, and if two people had children, then could they live together, or was it just all spread around in this 90-member family?
Nope, highly regimented, highly regimented. If you are married and you're led to join the Shakers, you were expected to basically give up your marital relationship and live as brother and sister with your spouse. And similarly, if you were married and you were coming in as a family with children, your children would be raised with the Shaker children of their gender, which would be the children of other people who had joined, and then all of these orphans who were there.
And were the children separate then?
Yeah. So you wouldn't have your kid living in your bedroom with you. You would have your child be sent to the Shaker dormitory, and your husband would be in a men's room, and the wife would be in a women's room. And for this reason, we wind up with these couples who who are in this halfway position. And for this reason, we also find people who sort of join and then they realize, wow, I think I really want to go back to married life. And so you do find a high rate of turnover in the communities with people who decide that the lifestyle isn't going to work for them after all.
When the union meetings would happen, you wouldn't necessarily be then connected to your husband at that time.
My sense of things is I don't even think that your husband is assigned to the same family. That you're I think that you basically you're in a situation where you're maybe living on different sides of the colony. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking Dr. Folk for a very interesting and enlightening presentation.